Hello, and welcome to another episode of Solipsist Watched. I'm your host, the Social Solipsist, and this week I watched 1986's Big Trouble in Little China. Now, Big Trouble in Little China is a commonly referenced film as a bit of a cult classic. Frankly, I wasn't really sure what to make of it going into it. I wasn't really sure what to make of it as I was watching it. And as I come out of it, I have a better sense of it, but I'm still struggling a little bit with it. Where do I even start with this? Big Trouble in Little China is directed by John Carpenter, who is a director who I guess I would say I have great admiration for, but none of his films that I have seen have quite. There's always little parts of them that just don't seem quite right to me. And it's hard to talk about this issue because usually when I don't like a director or something like that, I can tell the reasons why. But there's just something about Carpenter's films that, as much as I can pinpoint all the things he's very, very good at, like he's very clearly, technically speaking, an extremely competent director. I can never quite put my finger on what I don't like. And that continues to be the case with this film. By all accounts, it's extremely well made. And yet, there's something about it, and it could just be the curse of the scripts that he worked with that I've seen, or who knows what else. But there's something about Carpenter's work that always ends up rubbing me the wrong way. And that's not even a preconceived notion, as I didn't realize this was one of his until after I had watched it. So, boy, what do we talk about with Big Trouble in Little China? It is pitched as a comedy action film. We'll get into that. It is one of the most flamboyant movies I've ever seen in which nothing happens. In all seriousness, there is not that much to talk about outside of the technical and direct artistic aspects of it, because I feel like the story and the script and the plot are all basically non-existent. The plot is the most generic of generic, action hero saves the girl script. Like, you can tell that from the cover art, right? Like, it's this stylized piece of art that's supposed to, paint this very tropified vision of the, action hero from the 70s, 80s, well, going back earlier, but, that sort of thing. And it isn't really that. And it seems to be deliberately not that, but I don't know how much credit to give it. So let me step back. The script is awful. And it's questionable how much of it is intentionally awful. There are aspects of it that are clearly written to be deliberately parody or are structurally oriented towards, satirizing action films and comedy films. And yet at the same time, I have to say, like, as you've probably heard me say in this show, and I've said many, many times, just because you lampshade something doesn't make it good. It doesn't excuse the core issue. For those of you unfamiliar with the term, lampshading is basically like you deliberately point out the problem, as if to acknowledge it in a pseudo fourth wall break, but then you just keep going with it despite that. It's basically a very explicit call out to suspension of disbelief. And that is a staple of parody films, of which there were a great many, especially in the 80s. And I was sort of going over this film in my head and comparing it to other things and trying to parse out exactly what it is. Because the first thing I was thinking about was, well, okay, I'll get back to that in a second. This film is very silly, but it is not that funny until like the last third. I basically didn't laugh at all up until that point. And for a film that is, being put forth as action comedy, especially compared to other films that would came out prior and would come out after, it's sort of in this weird spot by not being that funny. In a lot of ways, it is much more for I don't want to say like students of cinema, because that sounds snooty, and I don't think that's not what I mean, and I don't think that's what Carpenter intended either. But it's clearly, to some extent, Carpenter explicitly using a bad script that he was given to deliver commentary on action films and comedy, and with surprising deftness and subtlety, sort of lampoon tropes. And that's a weird thing to say because nothing about this film is subtle. But the meta-narrative about, the things that it's poking fun at is not that overt. Compared to something, and here's what I'm going to get back to my previous point, compared to something like Airplane, which is the first thing I thought of, really, where much of both structurally and script-wise, it has direct, it's direct jokes that have specific things they are commenting upon. Whether it's in movies or in pop culture or whatever else. But that's a bad comparison to make, even though it's the first thing that came to my mind, because it is so structurally different. Big Trouble in Little China is very much about this non-existent plot. It revolves around that. Whereas Airplane basically amounts to a structured, it's a pseudo-structured series of skits and one-liners, right? If you're a great lover of Airplane, I hold no grudge, but I don't think Airplane is the grand comedic, brilliant comedic film that everyone else seems to think it is. I think it's got its moments. I think it's got some great stuff in it. I just don't think it's worthy of great praise for, as a film. So to come back to Big Trouble in Little China, then I started thinking about, okay, what else can I compare it to? Well, obviously it's poking fun at some of the it's poking fun at some of the the American action film tropes. So guys like Schwarzenegger. It's making fun of some of the both the like Hong Kong action stuff that was coming over prior and at the time, as well as some of the like I'm not sure what the right term is, but like Chinese exploitation films where American filmmakers or other non-Asian filmmakers would take, you know, these cultural hallmarks of this other, whether it's Hong Kong cinema or China or even Japan, and repurpose them very sloppily to make a lot of bad, Asian coded, big air quotes, films. And this film obviously does a lot of that, where it's like really leaning into the absurdity of some of this like Asian coding as done by Hollywood. And then so if it's making fun of those things, which take themselves very seriously, then what else can you compare it to? Well, there's the vehicles for those former action actors who, as they grew a little bit older, would stop doing the really severe action films, both as they aged and as the market for those things sort of slowly degraded. And so you have comedy films, the likes of not True Lies. What's the name of that? True Lies. True Lies, and then like other more comedy oriented films that Schwarzenegger would make. A lot of these like films where either former action guys or guys who look like they should have been action guys end up in doing comedy films. And then I had to compare that to the swath of films, both in the 80s and the 90s, coming, a lot of them from former SNL people, primarily guys like Eddie Murphy and Chris Farley and David Spade and some others David Spade doesn't really fit into the category I'm about to discuss, but where you have a comedic actor who is placed in an action film, and rather than the action actor put in a comedic film, and how those two things compare. Now, not to go on too much of a tangent, I promise I keep this extremely brief. I don't particularly like a lot of the latter, where you have these comedic actors doing action stuff, because they tend to not be very good at it. I think one of the few exceptions might be Eddie Murphy in 72 Hours. I recall being like one of the only films of that era that I thought he did quite well in. But it's been years since I've seen that, so don't quote me on that. And so we come back to Big Trouble in Little China. And it's none of these things, right? It's not about the action hero. It's not about the comedic hero. In fact, structurally, it's not really about the hero at all. Structurally, it's about nothing. And I don't want to call it a deconstruction either, because that implies a level of literary intent that this clearly does not have. But it's still fascinating, and it's still really entertaining, but for reasons that are hard to pinpoint. Kurt Russell plays the supposed main character, but he's completely inept for most of the he's not inept. He's not, his character is not played in farce, but he does nothing throughout the entire film. He contributes almost nothing to the story, but at the same time, almost nobody else does either. And that gets us back to the the script, whether intentional or otherwise, is structurally and both structurally and as like dialogue wise a disaster. They sort of they very intentionally are poking fun at the like having a character enter the room and monologue for 10 seconds to deliver their whole backstory. They like it wavers dramatically, and I think this is intentional, but again, I can't give too much credit because it's so bizarre. It wavers dramatically between just dumps of exposition that are so dense and so overt that you must have written that intentionally, followed by sections where they similarly overtly say, somebody asks what's going on, usually Kurt Russell's character, and they just say, don't worry about it. And then they just move on. and it's fascinating. This movie is undeniably fascinating as an art piece. And it is also undeniably very entertaining in a large part of it. But it has these lulls and these clear problems with the script that are, it's barely a script. It's a mishmash of sort of unstructured scenes. And yet it comes together in something that's somehow compelling, and I'm sort of upset about that. I find it extremely confusing because I feel like I should be more upset at its like very overt failures and or deliberate choices that don't work. But there's also these other aspects that work so well. I don't remember if I've talked about, I think I've talked about Kurt Russell on this show before, but excuse me. I'm just sort of rambling too much and not taking a second to breathe. Oh, okay. I think I've talked about Kurt Russell before, but I don't recall what the context was. I don't think Kurt Russell's a particularly good actor. That said, this might be the best thing I've seen him in. I'm trying to think off the top of my head. Hold on. Why am I not remembering what else I've watched him in recently? Anyway. So, yeah, Kurt Russell, not a great actor, but sort of fits weirdly. A number of the other actors are all pretty darn good, or at least like fit their purposes very well. The guy who plays Lo Pan, James Hong, is a fantastic character actor who's in a lot of different things, and he leans into this role and brings a level of depth to it that it doesn't deserve, but simultaneously could not exist in any other way. It's incredibly compelling, and like a lot of this fills in a lot of the script, like a lot of these problems with the script, because you're just kind of enthralled by the delivery and what's being shown on screen. Which, speaking of which, sets and costumes and makeup and most of the effects, lots of practical effects, which of course Carpenter's films do tend to have. The only issue I have is with some of the like special digital effects, which are not so great, but the like everything else is kind of incredible. In fact, possibly underrated. Some of the sets in particular are like just like goes from warehouses to absurdist hellscapes to like weird neon filled malls and stuff that you go, well, that's clearly all foam core, but I don't give a shit because this still looks fantastic. Like it's not even done even the things that aren't done really well production wise are still so charming in the way they are done that you just kind of you can't help but fall in love with it a little bit. And cinematography and the editing is pretty impeccable. And again, that's something I tend to feel about Carpenter's work. Although again, I'd like to figure out someday why I find it, like try and nail down what it is about his stuff that doesn't always quite work for me. This one might be the thing that bothers me the least, and I think that, well, or at the very least, anything that does bother me about Carpenter's particular work is drowned out by the problems with the things he wasn't really in charge of. Those, being the script and some of the production stuff that would have been done over his head. Allegedly, this is the film that killed Carpenter, caused Carpenter to sever all ties with mainstream production houses, which is fascinating because it still sort of like comes together. But again, like there are these core problems that I can't get past. And I'm going to have to rewatch this one day. And try and figure out now with greater context of figure out if the first 2/3 are better knowing what the last bit is like or anything like that. Cause that was also part of the problem, is just going into the film and sort of expecting one thing and getting something a bit another. Because I was sort of expecting more of that like action hero with comedic beats stuff, and it turning out not to be that was jarring. So yeah, I mean, script and plot and tone are a mess, and having whole sections of it that are silly without being funny is such an unusual thing in general, let alone in cinema, that I didn't really know how to react, and I don't know if I know how to react now, but I don't know. At this point, I've hit the point of just stream of consciousness rambling about the film, so better wrap this thing up. It's an interesting film. I definitely can't not recommend it to people. But I think if you were just expecting it to be, an action comedy or a comedy action film, then you're going to be surprised. It's definitely got a bizarre streak, and I almost wish it just took it a little further. Well, I wish they had time to clean up like some of the structural stuff, because I don't think it was all deliberate, and I don't want to give the writers that much credit, because there's clearly some stuff that's unintentionally a mess. But nonetheless, it's a fascinating watch, and it's short. It's like a bit over 90 minutes. So hard to say no. Anyway, yeah, glad I finally got around to watching it. I have some more, idea of the cultural references surrounding it now, which is part of what this whole saga of watching lots of films has been about, is catching up on some of that cultural context. And now I have just a little bit more. I don't regret it. Anyway, thank you guys for watching another episode of Solipsist Watched. I've been the Social Solipsist, and I will see you guys next time.